Oh, hello there. I'm Belchen Cooper. In this class, I'll read to all of you. Chapter 2 of The Great Gatsby.
Ass.
Oh. The Great Gatsby. I've Scott Fitzgerald. Chapter 2. About halfway between Wistig and New York, the motor road hastily drains the railroad and runs beside it for a quarter of a mile, so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges, and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the forms of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with a transcendent effort, a vast grey man. He moved dimly and already combing through the powder air. Occasionally a line of grey cows crawls along an invisible track, gives out a ghastly creak, and comes to rest. And immediately that grey men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud, which screens their obscure operations from your sight. But above the grey land and the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive, after a moment, the eyes of Dr. T. J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T. J. The Kohlberg are blue and gigantic, their retinas are 1 yard high. They look out of no face. Instead, from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently some wild wog of an oculist set them there to fashion his practice in the Borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or forgot them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many painless days, under sun and rain, brooding over the solemn dumping ground. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small foul river, and when the drawbridge is up to let barges through, the passengers on waiting trains can stare at the dismal scene for as long as half an hour. There's always a halt there of at least a minute, and it was because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he turned up in popular casts with her and, leaving her at a table, sauntered about, chatting with whomsoever he knew. Though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her, but I did. I went up to New York with Tom on the train one afternoon, and when we stopped by the sheep, he jumped to his feet and, taking hold of my elbow, literally forced me from the car. "We're getting off," he insisted. I think he tinked up a good deal at luncheon, and his determination to have my company bordered on violence. The supercilious assumption was that on Sunday afternoon I had nothing better to do. I followed him over a low whitewashed railroad fence, and we walked back 100 yards along the road under Dr. Kohlberg's persistent stare. The only building in sight was a small block of yellow brick sitting on the edge of the wasteland, a sort of compact main street ministering to it, and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the 3 shops it contained was for rent, and another was an all-night restaurant, approached by a trail of ashes. The third was a garage repairs. George B. Listen. Cars bought and sold, and I followed Tom inside. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the discovered wreck of a Ford which crouched in a dim corner. It had occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead. When the proprietor himself appeared in the door of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. He was a blond, spiritless man, mimicked, and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. "Hello, Wilson," old man said Tom, slapping him jovially on the shoulder. "I can't complain," answered Wilson unconvincingly. "Tweaked. Works pretty so." "No, he doesn't," said Tom coldly. "And if you feel that way about it—" "I don't mean that," explained Wilson quickly. His voice faded off and Tom glanced impatiently around the garage. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, and in a moment the thickish figure of a woman blocked out the light from the office door. She was in the middle-30s and faintly stout, but she carried her flesh sensuously as some women can. Her face, above a spotted dress of dark blue crepe de chine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty, but there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if the nerves of her body were continually smouldering. She smiled slowly and, walking to her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. Then she wet her lips, and without turning around spoke to her husband in a soft, coarse voice. "Get some chairs. Why don't you?" "Well, sure," agreed Wilson hurriedly, and went toward the little office, mingling immediately with the cement glow of the walls. A whitish tint veiled his dark suit and his pale hair as it veiled everything in the vicinity except his wife. He moved close to Tom. "I want to see you," said Tom intently. She nodded and moved away from him just as George Wilson emerged with 2 chairs from his office door. We waited for her down the road and out of sight. It was a few days before the 4th of July, and a grey, scrawny Italian child was sitting torpedoes in a row on the railroad track. "Terrible place, isn't it?" said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Kulberg. "Wilson? He thinks she goes to see her sister in New York." So Tom Buchanan and his girl and I went up together to New York, or not quite together. For Miles Wilson sat discreetly in another car. Tom deferred that much to the sensibilities of those Eastigas who might be on the train. She had changed her dress to brown figured muslin, which stretched tight over her rather wide hips as Tom helped her to the platform in New York, at the newsstand. She bought a copy of Town Tattle and a moving picture magazine, and in the station drugstore some cold cream and a small flask of perfume. Upstairs in the salon McQueen dried, she let 4 taxicabs drive away before she selected a new one, lavender coloured with grey upholstery, and in this we stood up from the mass of the station into the glowing sunshine. But immediately she turned sharply from the window and, leaning forward, tapped on the front glass. "I want to get one of those dogs," she said earnestly. "I want to get one for the apartment." We backed up to a grey old man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller, in a basket swung from his neck card. A dozen very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. "What kind are they?" asked Mice Wilson eagerly as he came to the taxi window. "All kinds." "What kind do you want?" "I'd like to get one of those police dogs." The man peered doubtfully into the basket, plunged in his hand and drew one up, wriggling by the back of the neck. "That's no police dog," said Tom. "No, it's not exactly a police dog," said the man with disappointment in his voice. "It's more of an Airedale." He passed his hand over the brown washig of a back. "Look at that coat. Some coat. I think it's cute, said Miles Wilson enthusiastically. That dog. He looked at it admiringly. There Dylan undoubtedly there was no doubt concerned in it somewhere, though its feet were. Startlingly white Chens and settled down into Miles Wilson's lap, where she fondled the weatherproof coat with rapture. Is it a boy or a girl? She asked delicately. That dog, it's a bitch, said Tom decisively. Here's your money. Hey. Drove over to Fifth Avenue, warm and soft, almost pastoral, on the summer Sunday afternoon. I wouldn't have been surprised to see a great flock of white sheep turn the corner. Hold on, I said. No, you don't, interposed Tom. Quickly. Myrtles will be hurt if you don't come up to the apartment. Won't you come on, she urged. I'll telephone my sister Catherine. Well, I'd like to, we went on, cutting back again over the park toward the West Hundreds. At 150th Street, the cab stopped at one slice in a long white cake of apartment houses, throwing a regal homecoming glance around the neighbourhood. Miles Wilson gathered up her dog and her other purchases and went haughtily. I'm going to have them keys come out, she announced as we rose in the elevator. And of course, I got to call up my sister. The apartment was on the top floor, a small living room, a small dining room, a small bedroom and a bath. The living room was crowded to the doors, with a set of Tip Street furniture entirely too large for it, so that to move about was to stumble continually over scenes of ladies swinging in the gardens of Versailles. The only picture was an over-enlarged photograph, apparently a hen sitting on a blaervark. Looked out from a distance, however, the hen resolved itself into a bonnet, and the countenance of a stout old lady beamed down into the room. Several old copies of Town Tittle lay on the table together, with a copy of Simon Cole Peter and some of the small scandal magazines of Broadway. Miles Wilson was first concerned with the dog. A reluctant elevator boy went for a box full of straw and some milk, to which he added on his own initiative a tin of large, hard dog biscuits enough, which decomposed apathetically in the saucer of milk all afternoon. Meanwhile, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey from a locked bureau door. I have been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon, so everything that happened has a dim, hazy cast over it, although until after 8 o'clock. The apartment was full of cheerful sun. Sitting on Tom's lap, Miles Wilson called up several people on the telephone. Then there were no cigarettes, and I went out to buy some at the drugstore on the corner. When I came back, they had both disappeared, so I sat down discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Cole, but either it was terrible stuff or the whiskey distorted things, because it didn't make any sense to me. Just asked Tom and Myrtle after the first drink. Miles Wilson and I called each other by our first names reappeared. Company commenced to arrive at the apartment door. The sister Catherine was a slender, worldly girl of about 30 with a solid, sticky bob of red hair and a complexion powdered milky white. Her eyebrows had been plucked and then drawn on again at a more rakish angle, but the efforts of nature toward the restoration of the old alignment gave a blurred air to her face. When she moved about, there was an incessant clicking as innumerable pottery bracelets jingled up and down upon her arms. She came in with such a proprietary haste and looked round so possessively at the furniture that I wondered if she lived here. But when I asked her, she laughed immoderately, repeated my question aloud, and told me she lived with a girlfriend at a hotel. Mr. McKee was a pale, feminine man from the flat below. He had just shaved, for there was a white spot of leather on his cheekbone, and he was most respectful in his greeting to everyone in the fun. He informed me that he was in the artistic game, and I gathered later that he was a photographer and had made the dim enlargement of Miles Wilson's mother, which hovered like an ectoplasm on the wall. His wife was shrill, languid, handsome and horrible. She told me with pride that her husband had photographed her 127 times since they had been married. Mice. Wilson had changed her costume some time before and was now attired in an elaborate afternoon dress of cream-coloured chiffon which gave out a continual rustle as she swept about the room, with the influence of the dress her personality had also undergone a change. The intense vitality that had been so remarkable in the garage was converted into impressive outdoor. Her laughter, her gestures, her assertions became more violently effective moment by moment, and as she expanded, the room grew smaller around her until she seemed to be revolving on a noisy creaking pivot through the smoky air. "My dear," she told her sister in a high, mincing shout, "most of these fellas would cheat you every time. All day. Think of his money. I had a woman up here last week to look at my feet." "What was the name of the woman?" asked Mice Mickey. "Mice Eberhard. I like your dress," remarked Mice Mickey. "Mice." Wilson rejected the compliment by raising her eyebrow in disdain. "It's just a crazy old thing," she said. "But it looks wonderful on you, if you know what I mean," pursued Mice Mickey. We all looked in silence at Mice Wilson, who removed a strand of hair from over her eyes and looked back at us with a brilliant smile. Mr. Mickey regarded her intently with his head on one side, and then moved his hand back and forth slowly in front of his face. "I should change the light," he said after a moment. "I'd like to bring out the modelling of the features. I wouldn't think of changing the light," cried Mice Mickey. Her husband said, and we all looked at the subject again, whereupon Tom Buchanan yawned audibly and got to his feet. "You please have something to drink," he said. "Get some more ice and mineral water, Myrtle. I told that boy about the ice." Myrtle raised her eyebrows in despair at the shiftlessness of the lower orders. "These people, dear," looked at me and laughed pointlessly. Then she flounced over to the dog, kissed it with ecstasy, and swept into the kitchen, implying that a dozen chefs awaited her orders there. "I've done some nice things out on Long Island," asserted Mr. Mickey. Tom looked at him blankly. "To what?" demanded Tom. "To studies. One of them I go on top with goes." The sister covering sat down beside me on the couch. "Do you lie down on Long Island too?" she inquired. "Really? I was down there at a party about a month ago. A man named Gatsby's. Well, they say he's a nephew or a cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm's." She nodded. "I'm scared of him. This absorbing information about..." My neighbour was interrupted by Mice Mickey's pointing suddenly at Catherine. "Chester, I think you could do something with her," she broke out, but Mr. Mickey only nodded in a bored way and turned his attention to Tom. "I'd like to do more work on Long Island if I could get the entry." "Ask Myrtle," said Tom, breaking into a short shout of laughter as Mice Wilson entered with a tray. "She'll give you a letter of introduction, won't you?" "Do what?" she asked, startled. "You'll give Mickey a letter of introduction to your husband, so he can do some studies of him." His lips moved silently for a moment as he invented. George B. Catherine leaned closer me and whispered in my ear, "Can't stand them." She looked at Myrtle and then at him. "What I say is, why go on living with them if they can't stand them?" The answer to this was unexpected. It came from Myrtle, who had overheard the question, and it was violent and obscene. "It see," cried Catherine triumphantly. She lowered her voice again. "It's really his wife that's keeping them apart. She's a Catholic." Daisy was not a Catholic, and I was a little shocked at the elaborateness of the lie. "When they do get married," continued Catherine. "Oh, do you like Europe?" she exclaimed surprisingly. "Just last year. No, we just went to Monte Carlo and back. We went by way of Marseilles. We had over 1,200 to lose when we started, but we got gypped out of it all in 2 days in the private rooms. We had an awful time getting back, I can tell you. Pod, the late afternoon sky bloomed in the window for a moment like the blue honey of the Mediterranean, and then the shrill voice of my Smicky called me back into the room. I almost made a mistake too, she declared vigorously. I almost married a little kike who'd been after me for years. I knew. He was below me. Everybody kept saying to me, Lucille, that man's way below you. But if I hadn't met Chester, it's but listen, said Myrtle Wilson, nodding her head up and down. Well, I married him, said Myrtle ambiguously. Why did you, Myrtle? Demanded Catherine. Myrtle considered. I married him because I thought he was a gentleman, she said finally. I thought he knew something about breeding. You were crazy about him for a while, said Catherine. Crazy about him, cried Myrtle incredulously. Who said I was crazy about him? She pointed suddenly at me, and everyone looked at me accusingly. I tried to show by my expression that I expected no affection, though only crazy. I was when I married him. I know right away I made it mistake. He borrowed somebody's best suit to get married in and never even told me about it, and the man came after it one day when he was out. Oh, is that your suit? I said. She really ought to get away from him, resumed Catherine to me. They've been living over that garage for 11 years. The bottle of whiskey second owner was now in constant demand by all present, excepting Catherine, who felt just as good on nothing at all. Tom rang for the janitor and sent him for some celebrated sandwiches, which were a complete supper in themselves. I wanted to get out and walk eastward toward the park through the soft twilight, but each time I tried to go, I became entangled in some wild, strident argument which pulled me back as if with ropes into my chair. Yet high over the city airline, Avila windows must have contributed their share of human secrecy to the casual watcher in the darkening streets, and I saw him too, looking up and wondering. I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life. Myrtle put her chair close to mine, and suddenly her warm breath poured over me the story of her first meeting with Tom. It was on the two little seats facing each other that are always the last ones left on a train. I was going up to New York to see my sister and spend the night. He had on a dress suit and patent leather shoes, and I couldn't keep my eyes off him, but every time he looked at me, I had to pretend to be looking at the advertisement over his head. When we came into the station, he was next to me, and his white shirt front pressed against my arm, and so I told him I'd have to call a policeman, but he knew I lied. I was so excited that when I got into a taxi with him, I didn't hardly know I wasn't getting into a subway train. All I kept thinking about over and over was you. Can't lie forever, she turned to my Smicky, and the room rang full of her artificial laughter. My dear, she cried, I'm going to give you this dress as soon as I'm through with it. I've got to get another one tomorrow. I'm going to make a list of all the things I've got to it. A massage and a wave and a collar for the dog, and one of those cute little ashtrays ready to just spring, and a wreath with a black silk bow for Mother's grave that'll last all summer. It was 9 o'clock. Almost immediately afterward I looked at my watch and found it was 10. Mr. Mickey was asleep on a chair with his fist clenched in his lap like a photograph of a man of action. Taking out my handkerchief, I wiped from his cheek the spot of dried leather that had worried me all the afternoon. The little dog was sitting on the table looking with blind eyes through the smoke, and from time to time groaning faintly. People disappeared, reappeared, made plans to go somewhere, and then lost each other, searched for each other, found each other a few feet away, sometime toward midnight. Tom Buchanan and Mice Wilson stood face to face discussing in impassioned voices. William Mice Wilson had any right to mention Daisy's name. Daisy, 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 shouted Mice Wilson. I'll say it whenever I want to. Daisy. Making a short F movement, Tom Buchanan broke her nose with his open hand. Then there were bloody towels upon the bathroom floor and women's voices. Scolding and high over the confusion a long broken wail of pain. Still. McKee awoke from his doze and started in a daze toward the door. When he had gone halfway, he turned around and stared at the skinny his wife and Kathleen scolding and consoling as they stumbled here and there among the crowded furniture with articles of aid and the despairing figure on the couch bleeding fluently and trying to spread a copy of Town Tattle over the tapestry scenes of Versailles. Then Mr. McKee turned and continued on out the door. Taking my hat from the chandelier, I followed. Come to lunch someday, he suggested. As we groaned down in the elevator, keep your hands off the lever, snapped the elevator boy. I beg your pardon, said Mr. McKee with dignity. All right. I agreed. I was standing beside his bed and he was sitting up between the sheets, clad in his underwear, with a great portfolio in his hands. Then I was lying half asleep in the cold lower level of the Pennsylvania station, staring at the Morning Tribune and waiting for the 4 o'clock train. To be continued.